In 1997, William Crystal and Robert Kagan founded the Project for a New American Century. The organization's membership read like a roster of future Bush administration officials: Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, with Scooter Libby, John Bolton. These plans would become American policy after 2001. PNAC published letters urging regime change in Iraq throughout the late 1990s. A January 1998 letter to President Clinton, signed by Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Bolton, and others, called for military action to remove Saddam Hussein from power. This was more than 3 years before September 11th. The Iraq War was planned long in advance. The attacks of 2001 provided the opportunity, not the cause.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
On Christmas Day 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. America had won. For 45 years, every sacrifice had been justified by the Soviet threat. The military spending, the covert operations, the compromise principles, the lives lost in Korea and Vietnam, and countless smaller conflicts. The ideological struggle that had defined the post-war world was finished. What would America do with its victory? The founders' answer was clear: return to normalcy. This is what America had done after the previous wars. After the Revolution, the Continental Army disbanded. After the Civil War, the Union forces demobilized. After World War I, the troops came home from Europe. The pattern was consistent: fight the war, win the war, come home. But the Cold War had lasted so long, 45 years, that a permanent national security state had emerged. Institutions had been built. Careers depended on continued conflict. Industries had grown around military production. A foreign policy establishment had formed that saw American hegemony as not as temporary, but as permanent necessity. In 1998, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright articulated the governing assumption: if we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall. We see further into the future. The indispensable nation. We see further. We stand taller. This was not humility. This was not the founders' vision of a republic among nations. This was imperial self-conception. America as the essential power, the shaper of the world, the enforcer of order. The 1990s are remembered as a decade of peace and prosperity. But they were not. They were a decade of intervention. The Gulf War, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, ongoing strikes against Iraq. More importantly, they were the decade when the architecture of permanent intervention was constructed. NATO expanded to Russia's borders despite promises to the contrary. The doctrine of humanitarian intervention was established. America could bomb countries without UN authorization if we deemed the cause just. The neoconservative movement captured key positions and published blueprints for regime change. The peace dividend was spent on new wars and new commitments. Every seed of the 21st century's disasters was planted in the 1990s. Understanding this decade is essential to understanding why the peace that should have followed the Cold War became instead the forever wars. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 13 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the Indispensable Nation, post-Cold War interventionism, and the squandered peace. This episode continues part 5 of our series, The War on Terror and Its Origins. Where episode 12 examined Afghanistan and the creation of Al-Qaeda, this episode examines the broader pattern of 1990s interventionism that set the stage for the conflicts that followed. This episode corresponds to Article 13 of our written series, and given the scope of the material, a decade of consequential actions, this will allow us to explain a little bit more detail than the written article provides. Let's begin with the moment of victory. The Soviet Union had collapsed. America stood alone as the world's sole superpower. The question of the decade was simple. What would America do with unipolar power? In 1992, a document leaked from the Pentagon that revealed the thinking of those who would dominate American foreign policy for the next 3 decades. The Defense Planning Guidance was crafted by Paul Wolfowitz and Louis Scooter Libby under Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. Its core thesis was stark. The United States must prevent the emergence of any rival power in any region. The document stated, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. We must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role." Not rivals that threatened America, rivals that might aspire to a regional role. The goal was not defense, but dominance. Permanent, unchallengeable, global. When leaked, the document caused controversy. It was officially disavowed and softened, but it was not abandoned. The people who wrote it, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Libby, they would return to power under George W. Bush and implement its vision. This was the neoconservative blueprint, years before neoconservatism became a common term. The hegemonic vision was not the only option. Pat Buchanan articulated an America First conservatism. The Cold War had required global commitment. With the Cold War over, come home and rebuild the nation. The libertarian tradition, represented by Ron Paul, argued for free trade without military commitments, commerce with all nations, alliances with none, precisely what the founders recommended. Realist scholars like John Mearsheimer advocated restraint. Maintain the balance of power without seeking global hegemony. These positions existed. They were articulated by serious people with serious arguments. They were marginalized rather than refuted. The foreign policy establishment simply proceeded as if no alternatives existed. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The context was more complicated than the simple narrative of aggression. Iraq had been an American ally throughout the 1980s. The Reagan and Bush administration supported Saddam against Iran, providing intelligence and tacit approval for a weapons program. Donald Rumsfeld had visited Baghdad. The photograph shows him shaking hands with Saddam. Days before the invasion, U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie told Saddam, "We have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait." Once the invasion occurred, Bush assembled an international coalition. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, the most intensive bombing campaign since World War II. The ground war lasted 100 hours. Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. American casualties were minimal. Iraqi casualties were massive. Estimates range from 20,000 to 35,000 military deaths, with thousands more civilians. Bush declared victory. He announced that Vietnam syndrome had been kicked. America had demonstrated that it could project power, win quickly, and suffer few casualties. But the deployment itself planted seeds of disaster. American forces in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest cities and sites, enraged religious conservatives throughout the Muslim world. Osama bin Laden, who had offered to defend Saudi Arabia with his Mujahideen veterans, was horrified when the kingdom chose American infidel troops instead. The grievance would fuel al-Qaeda's war against America for decades. The war ended, but the suffering intensified. The United Nations imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq, the most punishing sanctions regime in modern history. Iraq could not sell oil. It could not import the goods its populations needed to survive. The humanitarian consequences were catastrophic. Infant mortality soared. Preventable diseases spread. Malnutrition became endemic. Studies estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died. In 1996, Madeleine Albright was asked about reports that 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a consequence of sanctions. Her response? "We think the price is worth it." The price. 500,000 dead children, by this estimate, was worth it. This was American policy stated plainly on national television. The sanctions continued for 12 years. They did not remove Saddam from power. They devastated the civilian population while the regime survived. The moral mathematics were perverse. To punish a dictator, America helped kill his country's children. The interventions of the 1990s established patterns that would persist for decades. Somalia demonstrated that American military engagement, once begun, would never truly end. Yugoslavia established that America could wage war without UN authorization if the cause was deemed just. Somali civil war and famine produced harrowing images for American television. Starving children, collapsed government. President Bush sent troops for a humanitarian mission in December 1992. President Clinton inherited and expanded the mission. What began as feeding the hungry became nation building, then hunting warlords. On October 3rd, 1993, a raid in Mogadishu went catastrophically wrong. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. 18 American soldiers were killed, and the bodies of dead Americans were dragged through the streets, with footage broadcast worldwide. Clinton withdrew ground forces, and Somalia was declared a failure. But the withdrawal was not what it appeared. Ground troops left in 1994. American involvement continued. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, the CIA conducted operations in Somalia. When the war on terror began, Somalia provided new justification. Al-Shabaab, an Islamist militia that emerged in 2006, affiliated with al-Qaeda, the group that had not existed when Congress authorized force against September 11th perpetrators, became a target under that very authorization. The bombing continued through every subsequent administration. Obama dramatically increased drone strikes. Trump loosened the rules of engagement, and Biden continued the campaign. As of late 2025, the United States had conducted over 100 airstrikes in Somalia that year alone. Most Americans are unaware their country is at war in Somalia. The legal basis for the ongoing war is the 2001 authorization for use of military force, passed 3 days after September 11th, to authorize action against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the attacks. Again, Al-Shabaab did not exist on September 11th. It was formed in 2006, 5 years after the attacks. It could not have planned or aided the attacks because it did not exist. The legal theory is that Al-Shabaab is an associated force of al-Qaeda and therefore covered by the 2001 authorization. The theory has never been tested in court. It has never been voted on by Congress. It has simply been asserted. This interpretation transforms a specific authorization against specific attackers into authorization for permanent global war against anyone designated as an associated force. First intervention, 1992. Ground troops withdrawn, 1994. Bombing continues in 2026. 34 years and counting. Somalia remains a failed state. Al-Shabaab remains active. American bombing has not achieved any stated objective. This is not learning from failure. This is failure becoming permanent. Yugoslavia dissolved violently between 1991 and 1995. The wars that followed killed over 100,000 people. The Srebrenica massacre of July 1995 crystallized the horror. Serbian forces systematically murdered approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, the worst mass killing in Europe since World War II. NATO launched airstrikes against Serbian positions. The Dayton Accords imposed a settlement. The intervention was conducted without UN Security Council authorization. NATO acted independently, claiming humanitarian necessity justified action without approval that Russia would have blocked. The precedent was established. Humanitarian concerns could justify military action without UN authorization. In 1999, NATO launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Serbia over Kosovo. Albanian Kosovars faced ethnic cleansing. NATO responded with force. No UN authorization was sought. Russia and China would have vetoed. NATO acted alone. Serbia eventually capitulated. Kosovo became independent in 2008. The doctrine of humanitarian intervention was established. Sovereignty yielded to human rights as defined by the United States and its allies. The doctrine sounds noble in principle, but in practice, it raised some troubling questions. Who decides when intervention is justified? The United States and its allies decided for themselves. This doctrine would be invoked again for Libya in 2011, producing another failed state and regional chaos. It would not be invoked for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen or other situations where Allied governments committed violence. The selective application suggests that humanitarian intervention was not a neutral principle, but a tool of American power, invoked when convenient, ignored when inconvenient. Russia was humiliated. Its traditional ally Serbia was bombed despite Russian objections. Russia's veto in the Security Council, the mechanism that was supposed to protect great power interests, was simply bypassed. Russia saw NATO bombing Serbia as a demonstration of what could happen to Russia itself. NATO was not a defensive alliance. It was an offensive tool of American power. And NATO was expanding, moving closer to Russian borders. The perception would shape Russian policy for decades. The confrontation over Ukraine had its roots in Kosovo. No decision in the 1990s would have greater consequences than NATO expansion. The warnings were clear. They were ignored. And everything the critics predicted came to pass. When the Cold War ended, Western leaders assured Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward. The assurances were verbal, not codified in a treaty. But it was made. Secretary of State James Baker told Gorbachev that NATO's jurisdiction would not move 1 inch eastward. Gorbachev allowed German reunification on this understanding, and the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War ended peacefully. Declassified documents from the National Security Archive confirm these assurances were made. Western officials now deny any promises existed. The documents say otherwise. Despite the assurances, NATO expanded relentlessly. 1999, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. 2009, Albania and Croatia. 2017, Montenegro. 2020, North Macedonia. 2023, Finland. 2024, Sweden. The alliance doubled from 16 members in 1991 to 32 members today. NATO's eastern border moved from Germany to Russia's doorstep. The Baltic states, NATO members since 2004, share borders with Russia. And Article 5, the mutual defense provision, means that an attack on Estonia requires American military response. The Cold War generation of diplomats and strategists warned against expansion with remarkable consistency. George Kennan, the architect of containment policy, the man who designed the strategy that won the Cold War, called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. In 1997, Kennan predicted that it would inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion and restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations. William Perry, Clinton's own Secretary of Defense, opposed expansion and considered resigning. He later called his failure to prevent it one of his greatest regrets. Jack Matlock, the last American ambassador to the Soviet Union, warned of Russian reaction. Henry Kissinger cautioned specifically against moving toward Ukraine. The entire generation that had managed the Cold War, hawks and doves alike, Republicans and Democrats, warned that expansion would produce exactly the consequences that occurred. They were ignored by a younger generation that believed history had ended and Russia would just simply accept American hegemony. Everything the critics predicted came to pass. Russia's cooperative period ended. the hopes of the early 1990s that Russia might join the Western system evaporated. The relationship deteriorated steadily. Vladimir Putin explicitly cited NATO expansion as grievance. His 2007 Munich speech marked the definitive end of Russian accommodation. Georgia in 2008. Russia invaded when Georgia moved toward NATO membership. Ukraine in 2014. Russia annexed Crimea and fomented conflict in eastern Ukraine when a pro-Western government took power under a coup. Ukraine in 2022. Full-scale war. Whatever one thinks of Russian actions and the invasion violated international law, the context includes decades of NATO expansion despite Russian objections and explicit American warnings. The costs continue to mount. Thousands dead, millions displaced, European energy crises, nuclear risk, a new Cold War that may last decades. Kennan's prediction was exactly correct. The most fateful error produced exactly the consequences he foresaw.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning.
Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from general welfare to the new Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
NATO expanded eastward, and humanitarian intervention became doctrine. A group of thinkers was developing something more ambitious, a comprehensive blueprint for American global dominance. In 1997, William Crystal and Robert Kagan founded the Project for a New American Century, a think tank advocating American global leadership without apology. The organization's membership read like a roster of future Bush administration officials. Dick Cheney signed the founding statement. So did Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Louis Scooter Libby, John Bolton. These plans these men developed in the late 1990s would become American policy after 2001. PNAC published letters urging regime change in Iraq throughout the late 1990s. A January 1998 letter to President Clinton, signed by Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Bolton, and others, called for military action to remove Saddam Hussein from power. This was more than 3 years before September 11th. The Iraq War was planned long in advance. The attacks of 2001 provided the opportunity, not the cause. The people who signed the 1998 letter were positioned to implement their vision when the moment arrived. In September 2000, PNAC published a comprehensive strategy document, Rebuilding American Defenses. The document called for maintaining American military preeminence indefinitely. It advocated forces capable of fighting multiple simultaneous wars. It called for regime change in hostile states. The document was candid about obstacles to transformation. It acknowledged that fundamental change would be slow. Absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later, the catastrophic and catalyzing event arrived. The new Pearl Harbor happened. And the transformation PNAC had outlined proceeded rapidly. The continuity between PNAC's planning and Bush administration policy was not coincidental. Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense, Wolfowitz became his deputy, Libby became Cheney's chief of staff, and Bolton served at state and later as UN ambassador. Cheney himself was vice president. The Iraq War, justified by claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved false, was sold as a response to September 11th, though Iraq had no connection to the attacks. And this became the implementation of plans developed years before. September 11th was not the cause of the Iraq War, it was the opportunity. The war had been planned. It waited only for the catalyzing event. The 1990s were not a decade of peace. They were a decade of preparation for permanent war. What the decade established: the Gulf War successes created overconfidence that would produce the Iraq disaster. The sanctions killed hundreds of thousands. American troops in Saudi Arabia enraged bin Laden. Somalia established the template for permanent, low-level war, 34 years and counting, with most Americans unaware it continues. Yugoslavia established that America could wage war without UN authorization, a precedent that would justify Libya and destabilize an entire region. NATO expansion created Russian grievance that would produce the Ukraine conflict, exactly as Kennan and every Cold War expert predicted. And PNAC provided the blueprint for regime change that awaited only its catalyzing event. The Cold War ended. The warfare state did not. The Soviet threat disappeared. New threats were found or created. The opportunity for restraint was rejected. The founders warned against foreign entanglements because they understood that such entanglements corrupt republics. The 1990s demonstrated their truth of their warning. The chance to return to Republican normalcy was rejected in favor of permanent hegemony. Madeleine Albright called America the indispensable nation. We stand tall. We see further. But we did not see what was coming. We did not see that the policies of the 1990s were creating the enemies we would fight in the 2000s. We did not see that NATO expansion would produce a new Cold War. We did not see that humanitarian intervention would become justification for endless war. Or perhaps some did see, and were just ignored. The price of that choice would be paid in the century that followed, in blood, treasure, and freedom. The indispensable nation would find that dispensing with limits produced limitless war. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 13 of Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. Next Sunday, Article 14 examines the special relationship and the Israel lobby, how foreign influence shapes American policy, applying consistent analytical standards to all American commitments. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at Jay Kellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. Until next time, have a great day.